So welcome to the Harvard Kennedy School Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, faculty member here at the Kennedy School, and I have the pleasure of hosting the seminar series this semester. Before we get started, a couple of notes of thanks. I'd like to thank the Salata Institute, the Harvard University Center for the Environment and Natural Resources Program at the Belfer Center, and the Mosavara Rahmani Center for Business and Government for their support of this seminar series. And especially, I'd like to thank Liz and Paul for all of their support, making everything go smoothly with our seminar series. I'd also like to thank Amanda Sardonis, who's long supported the work through this seminar series. Amanda's about to join the staff at the University of Vermont and help them in what they're doing, but she's been a phenomenal colleague and supportive of everything we've done on energy, environment, and resource issues here at the Kennedy School and the Belfer Center for quite a long time. I'm thrilled that we have the opportunity to kick off the seminar series, which like last year is hybrid. We are Zooming. We have colleagues joining us via live stream right now, but thrilled to have the opportunity to kick off the seminar with a discussion about what the United States can do in leading the efforts to decarbonize the global economy. We have with us today Joseph Majkut, who is the Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In his role, he leads the program's work understanding the geopolitics of energy and climate change and working to ensure a global energy transition that is responsive to the risk of climate change and the economic and strategic priorities of the United States and the world. Before joining CSIS, Joseph worked as the Director of Climate Policy at the Niskanen Center, where he led that group's efforts to research and promote carbon pricing, low carbon innovation, regulatory reform, and other market reforms to speed decarbonization. In 2014 and 2015, he worked in the US Senate as a Congressional Science Fellow supported by the AAAS and the American Geosciences Institute. As an economist, I always love being with a PhD in atmospheric sciences who appreciates the elegance of pricing carbon, and has developed a greater appreciation as well of the politics of this, to have a more thoughtful and nuanced view than sometimes we economists might have. But with that, Joseph, I want to say welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar. I'm going to hand it over to Joseph now, who will give us some opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A.
Thank you so much for having me. Scientists are known for their ability to understand the nuances of public policy and not make insane declarations about what should happen. It's really nice to meet you all, and I look forward to a robust discussion. Thank you for having me, Joe, and everybody at Harvard. I'll skip the preamble. I was a scientist. I entered the public policy space a few years ago. It's been a very interesting career trajectory. If students want to talk about that, I'm more than happy to spend time later doing so. I've just sort of always tried to devote myself to problems I find intellectually interesting, and being at the intersection of expertise and politics has been a place that I've just found like incredibly intellectually satisfying, as I'm sure all of you will. Our work at CSIS is, by our own design, meant to inform public policymaking in the United States with an eye toward what happens outside the United States. And for energy policy, that means we need to be attentive to what's happening domestically as well as what's happening abroad. And the history of our program is actually, I think, important here. You know, our program was stood up during the energy crises of the 70s and 80s. And the focus for a long time was energy security. And that meant relatively good access to oil and gas resources to fuel the US economy. It meant the real close connection of our national security strategy with our energy security strategy. And it also gave the US a role to play in sort of providing a global public good, which was a stable environment, or stable security environment for the oil and gas industry globally. And that, I kind of have been interested over the last couple of years in like, what role is the US going to play in energy transition that might be somewhat analogous? Where do we try to devise strategic initiatives that can help the US contribute to decarbonization, but also give us a role to play that, like the US policymakers want to see us have, one that's influential, one that competes with China or other countries. And today I want to talk a little bit about what that might look like, and happy to hear your feedback, because I think everyone's trying, you know, there are a lot of people who are trying to paint a picture of what that should look like, but no one's really quite sure what it will. The title of the talk, I can't remember what it is. Can the U.S. lead global decarbonization? It's like, I don't know, it's not meant to really mean anything specific, but it's meant to kind of probe at those questions of how do we create global public good with the politics that we have here today? A couple places where I think U.S. climate leadership has actually been important. I actually think it was important for establishing the Paris Climate Agreement. Paris Climate gave us long-term climate goals, 2 degrees centigrade, well below that, toward 1.5 C. And I think the U.S. having a relatively ambitious regulatory program under the Obama administration went to that. I think the U.S. having a diplomatic effort, which brought China fulsomely into the fold, was important to that, help resolve the sort of like developed versus developing nation conflict that had kept climate talks from really being global in scope or setting global goals. And I think it's interesting to ask now, like, okay, we're about to do this UN stock take, so are we leading on emissions? Like that might be the place to start. That's the thing that drives global climate change. We know we need emissions to go to zero or net zero, but we know we need to get them to zero if we're going to arrest the march of global warming. And skipping some stuff that I think is uninteresting now. UN stock take is taking place this fall. So I think we also want to know, like, where's the US standing against, amongst all the other countries. UN report from this month shows that emissions will probably peak and then maybe peak or slightly fall over the coming decade. This is based on what countries have pledged to do. So we have a somewhat long plateau for global emissions, and we kind of find ourselves, I think, now near the peak, if not beyond it. And that's challenging for a world that wants to get to 2C. Long term, the UN's assessment finds that we're probably targeting a world that looks at like 2.5 degrees centigrade by 2100. It's a remarkable victory over where we were a decade and a half ago. When I started working on this issue, we regularly talked about 4 or 5 degrees centigrade of global warming by the end of this century, but it's a far cry from where we want to be. And the stock take also assumes something that I think is relatively important, that countries are going to by and large meet the climate goals that they've already set for themselves. The US, under the Biden administration, has made a ton of progress and probably wants to go to climate meetings this fall saying, hey, we're doing it. We've got it done. We rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, but on top of that, we've accelerated our national ambition. So we're now saying we want to cut our greenhouse gas emissions against the reference value 50% by 2030. 50 to 52, I think, is the exact number. We passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is going to make a ton of investments in clean energy technology. It's going to keep our existing nuclear fleet alive. And then last year, Congress passed on a partisan basis, the IRA, which is going to turbocharge clean energy investment. And I think justifiably, you can claim it already pretty significant in the outlook for US greenhouse gas emissions. So what if we measure, right? There's a paper in Science this summer, compiled modeling results from 9 different groups. Did anybody from Harvard participate in this? Brystein et al? Maybe not. 9 groups. They found that in the presence of the IRA, economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions from the United States should fall between 33 and 40% by 2030, against the reference value, which is 2006, for weird historical reasons that we can just leave unaddressed. It's a notable but not extreme improvement. Without in the lack of the IRA, those same modeling groups find the expected fall would be 25 to 31%. The underlying economics of clean energy and the policies in place at the state level already meant the emissions were supposed to fall in the United States, especially in the power sector. But now the United States is going to spend handsomely on reducing emissions. We get another 5 to 10% out of it. Science paper admits that the abatement cost is somewhere between $27 and $102 per ton of CO2. That's what we're paying to reduce, average of $61 a ton. That compares favorably to reasonable estimates of the social cost of carbon, but since Joe Aldi's here, we'll also say that it compares disfavorably to the cost if we were to impose a carbon price, which we could get away with a much lower number and get the same emissions reductions. You're welcome. But compared to our goal, we still find ourselves wanting, right? The emissions gap is set to be somewhere between 0.5 and 1 gigaton of CO2 per year in 2030 between what our ambition is and what the IRA is slated to accomplish. And that is, of course, if we can actually finance, site, and deploy all the stuff that those computer models think will be economical in the presence of fairly handsome tax credits. I think that is definitely something we're going to have to work toward through permitting reform or other things. I'm going to box permitting reform. If you guys want to talk about it in the context of the conversation, that's great, but I do not want to waste the hour on it. Let's compare that to the global gap in ambition. And there, I think, like, I discovered this week, past week, the IRA is actually kind of a rounding error, which I think is weird because it's historical investments in climate and in energy. But the UN estimated the gap at 2030 for 1.5C. If the world was like really going to do it, at 20 to 24 gigatons of CO2. So an ungenerous comparison says that you need 40 IRAs. No one else in the world has the fiscal space to do an IRA level amount of subsidy. But you need 40, well, maybe the EU, but you need 40 IRAs to accomplish the emissions reductions necessary to get on a 1.5 track. And for 2C, where you need about half the emissions reductions by 2030, you need 20 IRAs. So we find ourselves in this funny place where, like, we are making big investments and we are really changing the nature of the energy system in the United States, but it is woefully too little for the challenge we face globally, and even against our own goals, we're going to find ourselves falling short. But I think it's also important to note that, like, US climate policy, and I would say global climate policy, are also changing. That the goal or the emissions reduction is an important geophysical metric, but it's not the only metric along which governments are trying to devise climate and energy policies. Over the past few years, we've seen governments take very different routes and a different approach. We now have policies based on industrial policy, investment, building stuff, trying to capture the value that everyone anticipates will be associated with an energy transition. And as capital accumulates in those different emerging industries, we expect costs to fall, learning by doing. And then one of the key arguments that we now see our political leadership making is the IRA is maybe going to miss emissions targets. Maybe it's, it's not really an emissions policy. It's an industrial policy. It's going to reduce the cost of clean energy. That clean energy is going to proliferate around the world. And that is a global public good in and of itself. It's a different externality than climate, but we can approach this one through subsidy. In stylized models, we're also starting to investigate what that looks like. Rhodium Group published a paper just over the summer trying to understand, well, if we get cost reductions in the technologies that the IRA is supporting, they're not out of line with sort of standard learning by doing models. How much, and then we have a world, there's like a sneaky part in the modeling, but then we have a world that really cares about climate change and institutes a global carbon pricing regime. What is the amplification of the emissions reductions that we get out of IRA around the world through reducing costs? And they found between now and 2100 an amplification factor of what I would say is 2.5. Amplification factor is vocabulary I'm using. It's not vocabulary that's in their paper, but that's a kind of like a carbon value associated with this learning by doing. It's also interesting because if the US can make those technologies cost competitive in the global landscape, you're also talking about export value for the US. We really like export value in oil and natural gas. Those have been good for our economy. They create all sorts of opportunities for economic statecraft, and the clean energy transition can do the same thing. Boston Consulting did a study also within the last year looking at IRA technologies, finding that the potential export value across the ones where we might be able to carve out a competitive position against China, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is like $20 to $30 billion within the next decade. That's the same size as today's LNG industry. It's the size of our grain exports. You're talking about clean energy being not an overwhelming export commodity from the United States, but a relatively sizable one. How do you do it? I think realizing that requires like a total reframe of how the US engages internationally on climate. I'm just not convinced personally, and I'm willing to argue about it because I could be totally wrong, that the future of climate leadership is going to big meetings and saying, we're doing this and we want you guys to do this. I think the persuasion we're going to have to leverage internationally is going to be much more about it's in our common interest to share these technologies, to arrive at a new kind of trade agreement. And that the terrain for US leadership on climate is going to look very different than it has over the last decades. We were successful and we did a good job, but the problems we face now are going to be totally different. That's because the energy transition is like largely like this physical thing, right? It's an engineering problem. It's a political problem, it's a science problem, but like we have large systems for fossil fuel production, distribution, and use that have to give way to systems that will depend on minerals, on infrastructure, and technology. My former colleague, Nikos Safos, who's now the chief energy advisor to the Greek prime minister in his final essay for CSIS, wrote about this in a way that I'd like to quote. He noted that, quote, oil, gas, coal, and chemicals today together account for 40% of all shipping traffic. The move away from fossil fuels to low carbon energy sources will change what international trade means. That's not just the rules, it's the stuff that gets moved around. Returning to the quote, and this shift presents enormous strategic challenges. What are those end quote. What are those enormous strategic challenges, and can the United States play a role in addressing them? Returns us to my original question of like, what is US leadership and how do we carve out a positive role for ourselves? It's helpful to sketch the characteristics of the net zero economy before we think about the tools we want to deploy. Take the IEA's net zero economy study from a couple of years ago. Too much hullabaloo about the timescales and some probably poorly phrased things about implications of a net zero economy for fossil fuel investment. They actually do a really great job of trying to understand like what does the energy system at net zero look like? And that's going to be relatively invariant, I would argue, whether we get there in 2040, 2050, or 2070. And they find that in that scenario, the oil market is much smaller than it is today, but it's probably going to have to be really emission sensitive. And so for the US as a large oil and gas exporter, and one that's probably going to be in a position to export more as we reduce our own consumption, trying to build an oil market that is an oil and gas market, that's like really, really good on methane emissions. That looks at the emissions intensity of the full value chain and has at the combustion side as much carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology as we can feasibly muster. It's crazy important because that's a place where we have an immediate economic and strategic advantage. The mineral economy in a net zero world is going to be much larger, right? So if the oil and gas economy sort of shrinks down to 20% of today's current size, that's a factor of 5 smaller. The mineral economy probably grows by a factor of 5. I think that's a coincidence. I don't think there's like some rule of nature that causes that to be the case. But we don't have at this moment a particular strength in the mineral economy. We dig a little bit of stuff out of the ground in the United States, but it's really hard to do here. We also don't do a lot of the processing or intermediary manufacturing steps that have ended up to be really important in how markets in those commodities get set up. And the US probably needs to develop a strategy for that. If anybody has any brilliant ideas on what that strategy should look like, I have a think tank job for you. And then lastly, we're going to use a whole different suite of technologies. And the technology innovation place is where the US probably has a chance to carve out a new and revised role for itself because of the IRA. Okay, so there's a couple transitions here. Got sidetracked. First is minerals. That's shifting the extractive economy away from coal, oil, and natural gas toward cleaner, and then to mining. And the second is industrial. That's the technology story. No one gets energy services from a lump of copper. Instead, we need to establish a supply chain that can give the world solar cells, wind turbines, batteries, heat pumps, copper wire, hydrogen electrolyzers, carbon capturing membranes, all this machinery of a high renewables net zero economy. And at the moment, China dominates the supply chain for almost all that. Part of the enormous strategic challenge that I think Nikos was talking about is we have to build a larger and more diverse supply chain for those goods really, really quickly to supply a net zero economy, to make it easier for countries to reduce their own emissions. And in doing so, we have to trade an energy system that's relatively diverse. OPEC Plus is super powerful in establishing like market prices, but we get oil and gas from all over the world. There's a lot of energy security that comes from that. These are really sophisticated markets that can respond to perturbation well, with one that's heavily concentrated in a strategic adversary of the United States, right? I'm not particularly China hawkish, I will admit. In Washington these days, that's kind of the favor, but this is, there's all sorts of reasons why you want to pursue resilience through diversification. Just to give you a couple numbers on that, because I think there actually is like risk to this. At each stage of the clean energy supply chain, China has a commanding lead. For critical minerals, it produces more than 90% of the rare earths that make magnets for turbines and motors. It produces more than 90% of the world's polysilicon for photovoltaics, and that has real issues for human rights, forced labor concerns regarding Xinjiang province. It refines 70% of the world's cobalt, more than 60% of the lithium. Both are critical for batteries. And one of the key insights that industrial policy does give us and can help us develop is that like that whole supply chain matters. Because if you have the intermediate step, if you're doing production of a certain kind, that gives you buying power on the upstream. That helps set the conditions for the labor and mines in the Congo that you otherwise don't really have a lot of power or influence to do anything about. And it's also a matter of economic strategy if we're looking toward an energy transition. There's a lot of value that's going to be gained from being able to support manufacturing facilities or be a part of this technological story. The IRA is designed to do that, right? Sorry it took me so long to get to IRA. But part of the criteria of the bill, even the most severe onshoring provisions, which contravene decades of like global economic and trade policy, are about bringing the benefits home. And I would say that, you know, the argument in Washington, it's like kind of true, is that if you didn't have this sort of protectionist, hawkish onshoring component of the IRA, it would not have been as large or as ambitious as it was, and it may not have passed at all, even in a Democratic-controlled Washington. Policymakers need and want to demonstrate early wins for their constituencies and the coalitions that will back continued action to reduce emissions over time. And that's what the IRA is trying to solve for. And it's totally clear that this is kind of working. I'll take one example, but there's a few others. I'm so tired of talking about EVs, so I was going to talk about solar. Is that okay? Okay, EVs in the question period. US right now has 8 gigawatts of solar manufacturing capacity online, which actually is like not terrible. But most of it's at the final stage. Like, so you're assembling from constituent materials, the modules. This is the stuff that you actually put into a field or on your roof. Right now, I think WoodMac, when I last looked, expects that we're going to install about 30 gigawatts of solar capacity in the US. So we actually produce at the module level a relatively fair bit of what we need. Let's say you're going to get on that climate path, right? The Princeton group, led by Jesse Jenkins, does some really interesting modeling, trying to understand the material needs of energy transition for the US. I would say a rough number, though their scenarios vary, is you're going to need about 70 gigawatts of solar capacity additions in the United States by the end of the decade every year. That's a significant public policy challenge in energy markets and in land use and a whole bunch of other things, but you also just need the stuff. And for the stuff, the story is actually kind of interesting. Post-IRA, if you look at industry data of announced projects, by 2030, we might have up to 85 gigawatts of solar module manufacturing capacity online in the United States, because there is an enormous tax credit for making solar modules in the United States under the IRA. Those tax credits are also slowly affecting the upstream. So we're looking at 43 gigawatts of solar cells. That's the little circle that you pack into modules. 20 gigawatts of silicon ingots and wafers, and 7 gigawatts of inverter capacity. So like the subsidies are driving an onshoring of this supply chain that'll help meet US needs, diversifying and enlarging the global solar supply chain in a way that's pretty helpful. There's still a sort of like, you know, if you have 85 gigawatts of solar modules and you only have 20 gigawatts of wafer capacity, you still need to use a global supply chain. You can't be autarkic. Nor should that be the goal. But there is a pretty significant set of investments that's being made here. The same story is happening in EV supply chains as well. We're seeing a lot of announcements about battery factories, and that's sort of now sort of bleeding down into the low or the upstream parts of that supply chain. The problem is that onshoring comes at the cost of efficiency. You have to subsidize production here in the United States because it's more expensive to make solar panels or EV batteries here. US DOE estimates that domestic manufacturing of solar panels costs 30 to 40% more than in international markets. That may come down a bit as we learn how to do here in the US, but a lot of it is like labor and high margins expected on investment in the United States. And those things aren't gonna like, I don't think structurally change, nor should we design climate policy so that they have to. It means it's unlikely we're going to become a significant exporter of solar technology. We're just going to, like under IRA, we're going to pay more and use more a domestic supply chain. But for alternative technologies, we actually might find opportunities. A good example here is this case for First Solar. So First Solar is they manufacture solar equipment here they're a US-based company. They manufacture it here and a couple places in Southeast Asia. Totally different chemistry than the crystalline polysilicon that we are kind of typically associate with like the falling costs of solar. I don't want to get into like a debate over which one is better, but part of the diversification is not just shouldn't just be geography, right? It should be like technology. Like maybe we need to find competitive routes to developing technology that US firms can support. We do a bunch of innovation at our fancy universities, including here and the neighboring institution as well. And like we want to find a pathway that they can, when innovation happens here, it gets supported, it gets deployed, and then it can be exported, because that's where we get amplification of our efforts. In December of 2021, the Development Finance Corporation made a $500 million loan available to First Solar to develop a manufacturing facility in India where they can make their solar cells for deployment in the Indian economy. India has like truly ambitious targets for deploying solar power to meet their energy needs and development needs. They also want factories as part of their economic development story. So there's a fairly robust industrial policy going on in India. It can be matched by investment from the US. And suddenly you have like kind of an interesting story developing where the US can provide technology and financing to help a country that is really important in geopolitical jockeying right now meet its climate and energy goals, diversify its own energy supply, and there's a real win-win here. And I think like finding those opportunities is crazy important. The key question is, like, I'm not sure how to make a list of the next 10, 20, or 50 projects that should receive that kind of support. And we probably like structurally can't let, put all this on the shoulders of the Development Finance Corporation, right? If we want to decide like that's a pathway to the US being a climate leader by helping other countries establish their own role in the energy transition, meet their own industrial policy goals, I think we're going to need to think carefully about what are the conditions under which we want to do that, which technologies, which manufacturers should the US support. We have a long history of like nuclear diplomacy. Like, are we going to pick that back up? We have recent experience with LNG, but which technologies that are on the frontier? Green hydrogen, carbon capture and utilization, long duration storage. How do we help create strategic diversification without undue cost is like a really big question. I think this is like totally available for intellectual and academic scrutiny. Kind of like, how should we score that kind of investment? I can kind of talk at a diagnostic level of why we think it's good, but how much we should be willing to spend and where we should spend it and how we should think about strategy, and one that changes over time as the technology and policy, as the relative cost of technology change and as the strategic interests of other countries change, I think is like totally rich and interesting. Now we can talk about trade. I also am like totally into climate clubs, because the other thing that has to go on is we got to rewire trade, right? I also think that it is possible that climate clubs help us move toward a world where we have like more efficient instruments. Because I don't think you want to create a world where you just got industrial policies everywhere. People are fighting over like who can own this piece of the supply chain, who can control this piece of the supply chain. We need to make sure that we sort of like, oh, this is like flagrantly illegal in the eyes of the WTO. We need to make sure that like on the process of trying to decarbonize, we don't like break world trade or lose the efficiency that has been so good for global economic growth, and like therefore just like sort of screw up a bunch of other things in the attempts to solve the climate problem. There's a couple of guidelines here that I think are interesting. Trade lawyers talk about a lot of this stuff, but can we develop a trade framework that's going to accept these kinds of subsidies on a temporary and targeted basis? Can we accept them in others? There's now this enormous trade case that's about to kick off in Europe regarding the import of Chinese electric vehicles, and the boundary between just better technology and stuff that has been over subsidized and is being dumped is hard to draw. And I think we're just going to have to like work really hard to figure out where we want to draw the lines. But at an even larger scale, I think it's important to think about the trade agenda in the era of energy transition. US is embracing protectionism. Other countries will do the same. Europe's also standing up a carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? For the first time. It starts next month. Companies that ship certain products to Europe are going to have to report the CO2 emissions associated with them. And in a couple of years, they're going to actually have to pay as if they were paying into the European emissions trading system. pretty textbook carbon price and border adjustment policy design, but it's immediately causing political challenges. It's being challenged at the WTO, and there are threats of reprisal. Officials, I think from India, I was writing this morning, I couldn't find the citation, but I know it happened, have even threatened, like, we're gonna border adjust European goods, but not on their carbon content, on the historical emissions associated with the European economy, right? So like you like immediately tools which look really good in the academic and intellectual sphere in the political world look really, really challenging and could cause all sorts of downstream problems. By the same degree, the picture's mixed. Other countries look at the European CBAM and start going, oh, maybe we should carbon price because that way we will capture revenue that would otherwise go to Europe, and we don't want that to happen. And we would then have smoother trade with European colleagues. Examples here are Japan and Turkey. Biden administration, I think, has been relatively ambivalent about the EU's border adjustment, but does support integrating climate and trade on a more sectoral level. So they've backed the global arrangement for sustainable steel and aluminum, which would have the US and the EU cooperate on standards for the emissions associated with the production of those two goods. And there'd be trade censures for countries outside those two who wanted to import steel and aluminum into the US or the EU. But also, you know, like I said, I've spent a lot of my time trying to figure out how do we build a bipartisan consensus around climate change? How do we make progress at the center of American politics? And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, the interest in carbon tariffs, border adjustments, some sort of like trade and climate tool is extremely high on both sides of the aisle in Washington for different reasons, and we need to like figure out a path through that. But there is this widespread belief that the US economy is more carbon efficient, even in its most carbon intensive places than other economies, particularly China. So the more we account for carbon and traded goods, the more competitive our producers will be. I'll insert a parenthesis here that the carbon pricing advocate in me must say, this is a sunk benefit if we don't have commensurate domestic policy to keep industry competitive in a climate adjusted trade world. A carbon tariff without a domestic complement gets the incentives, I think, to innovate exactly backwards, if I've got that right, Professor. So we need to we just need to be thoughtful in designing these things, but they're potentially really, really powerful. I read the academic literature on climate clubs over the summer, trying to understand, should we devote a lot of time and effort to build these things? And some of the proposals that we found are show that it can be remarkably good at reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally. And I would say even that the academic results show that a US-led carbon club can probably be the most powerful tool that we have in our arsenal for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Let me cite an example. In a 2021 working paper, Farid Farooqi, I don't actually know how to pronounce his name, Farrokhi, and a co-author showed that under ideal trade censure, a US-led climate club could reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 61% as other countries joined in, based on their own incentives to join. And the chain of countries is actually super interesting. So they actually modeled it. It's cool. I'm going to quote it. You start with the EU and the US, big markets, right? Next is Canada and a bunch of small countries. Then you get Australia, India, Japan, Korea, Mexico, Russia, Turkey, and Taiwan. Once all those are in, it's in the economic interest of China to join your climate club. And then last, you get Brazil and Indonesia. Once you have all of them joining, to join, you have to institute a set of optimal carbon taxes and production taxes. You need to set up border taxes for those outside the club. But you sort of get a forced cooperation, which reduces global emissions by 61%. Only 8% of that is due to the emissions reductions in the US and the EU, according to these modeling studies. So that's a much larger multiplier of American effort than we get on technology. Yeah.
Can you define a little bit better what carbon club means?
Yeah, totally. So it's totally different from a carbon tariff. Oh, no, I'm all good. So a climate club in this context, to be a member, you have to have a carbon price on your domestic manufacture, on your domestic production. And then you need to have trade censures on non-club members. And those trade censures extend beyond carbon border adjustment. So the other thing that this paper shows And one of the things I think we need to be cautious of as US policymakers are looking at carbon border adjustments and other tools is that carbon border adjustments end up being relatively ineffective at reducing global emissions. So in a climate club, you have a trade censure, which I think applies to basically all trade. If you're outside the club, we're going to put some censure on you associated with the carbon intensity of your economic production. In a carbon border adjustment, you're only doing that on the like carbon embedded in certain products. This is what the EU is doing. But you're doing that to bolster some sort of, or prevent unfair competition for your domestic, people who feel your domestic carbon price. And then in a tariff, you're just assigning some tariff associated with the carbon in goods that you want to import. I mean, that leaves aside like any domestic climate policy. So like that's how I would use the language. So the climate club is a much more expansive version of what a lot of policymakers are talking about tonight now, which is like more on the tariff and border adjustment scale. It's really focused on carbon embedded in products, not a broader economic measure. That makes it a much more challenging thing probably to achieve, and probably why it ends up being so powerful. Yeah.
So how strong and absolute is the trade censure suggested? It's not a tariff. And is it a total ban? Like what's the spectrum of measures?
I think it's a large import tax, but I didn't find in the paper a graph that shows you how large it is. There's a bunch of very complicated equations. I'm betting it's expensive, right? Like you need it to be big enough to incentivize people to join. So one thing I think is really interesting is like, can we engineer something as powerful as those climate clubs, or something that gets some of that power from where we are today, where we're much more focused on industrial policy, technology solutions. We have reluctance to embrace carbon pricing at the domestic level, but we do see a willingness to link the climate agenda with the trade agenda to capture, to protect domestic industry and to capture some advantage or perceived advantage. I have some ideas for how that works, but I think we can talk about it in the discussion. I think I think that's kind of like the next very interesting opportunity for finding a path to progress in the US. I think it helps like a trade agenda, which is like climate and industrial policy smart, will help us amplify our own efforts out of the IRA. And I think that will help, that gives me a sense of what the US leadership stance on climate may look like. It's a little hawkish, but I'll start there. I'm actually going to stop because I hit 40 minutes and that's about what I wanted to target. I'll close with two things. I want to thank Joe for having me, and I really look forward to a conversation.
Great. Thank you, Joe. I'll open with the first question, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience, and we'll run until 1:15. And as a reminder to everybody, when you get the microphone, a question is a sentence that ends with a question mark.
Goes up at the end.
So you talked here at the end about the idea and the potential for climate clubs. And I want to ask two questions about this.
Yeah.
One, and I reflect on this to a conversation I had with a representative of a developing country when I was in the US government.
Yep.
And they noted in the States, we can sometimes be selective on when we decide to work through the UN. And they noted that the problem for them is the UN is the only forum where they actually get a voice.
Right.
And so it's frustrating when the US kinds of selectively engages through full global multilateral processes versus doing something bilaterally or in a small group.
Yep.
So you began today talking a little bit about the UN stocktake, but closed a lot of discussion on what is sort of small clubs that may grow over time if we create the right kind of incentives.
Yep.
So how should, if you were to say advising the US government, you're trying to get other countries, you're trying to amplify your impact, you're trying to get more countries involved. How do you think strategically about this mix of fora that you're going to operate through? When is it in your interest to use an existing global forum like the UN negotiations? When should you strive to create fundamentally a new forum, this kind of trade, climate, industrial policy? Maybe that's reinvigorating the WTO, but there's a lot of a WTO reinvigoration plate beyond just this. So how do you think about the strategically, how would the US effectively engage through these different fora?
Right.
And then I have a second question about clubs and supply chains, but
Super
I'd love
cool.
to hear this first.
And there, yeah, the answer is probably related. I am a believer in small coordinated clubs making progress and then bringing that back to the larger fora, for like diffusion and amplification. I think that's very consistent with the model that Paris sets. After the Glasgow conference, I remember writing this like really excited essay about the First Movers Coalition and these like kind of plurilateral deals around just transition. Some of those things have worked, some of them haven't, right? As we learn what is going to be effective in navigating this like relatively challenging set of considerations, I think I'm a fan of smaller clubs. I take well the point that there is not a discontinuity, there's a slight contradiction if what you're saying is, man, the climate strategy of the United States should be like economic integration and we should be funding stuff relative to the needs of other countries, especially in emerging markets, and like developing a strategic technology portfolio. And then we should hammer them with these trade censures if they don't act right on climate. But like, that's where I think like these are intellectual tools that we need to kind of draw lines between when we're going about policy and entrepreneurship.
So the other question I have is, there's this vision of we're going to create climate clubs. We're going to have this kind of carrot and stick approach, depending on whether you're in the club or out.
Right.
We're going to use trade sanctions on those who are out. We also have at the same time this kind of emerging model in US policy that's very much about onshoring.
Yeah.
That if anything is to design an energy economy in the United States, and for that matter, there are those who think about this beyond the energy and climate space, where we just produce more of what we consume in the US. If we're in a world in which we're transitioning in the energy system, so there'll be less trade by definition in fossil fuels and related commodities. If we think we're going to be doing more of meeting our needs through domestic manufacturing, if other countries try to follow our suit, do we lose some of the leverage on trade if we're seeing more and more of a domestic-oriented climate and industrial policy among our major trade partners?
That's an interesting question. I think yes and no, right? So just because a good is like important to the energy system doesn't mean that it's just because a good is not part of the energy and climate energy system doesn't mean that it's not important to like greenhouse gas emissions. So like what would be a good example? Like, steel. Steel is super important for the energy economy, but it's like way more important in other parts of the economy. That's where most of the consumption is. And so if you're using trade tools to help decarbonize steel, then like I'm not sure that the energy transition is going to perturb trade enough to cause that to be a problem. But your broader point of like, if the world gets super geopolitical and like trade relations are just really being perturbed, does that cut off the ability of like trade sanctioning tools to drive decarbonization? I suppose it's possible, but there's just so much trade. It's hard to imagine that will be what happens in practice. I admit it, it's an interesting question though.
So let me open up for questions. Because we have colleagues joining us online, we're going to pass around the mic. So please wait for the mic. I'd like you to introduce yourself and then pose the question.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for being here. My name is Kevin. I'm a second-year MPP student. One of the big hot topic right now at UN COP is climate finance.
Yeah.
I wonder what your vision for US leadership on climate finance is going to look like.
Yeah.
I just want to note that it seems that US currently is not giving or pledging enough financing towards developing countries, but also at the same time, it seems that a lot of them are, or at least have recently joined the BRICS Bank, or the over the past couple of years become members of AIIB, which I feel like there's more of a economic incentive for them to align on receiving financing from countries led by China, for example. So wondering what your thoughts on US leadership in that space looks like.
Yeah, it's a great question. I left it completely open. One, we should definitely stop over-promising, right? I think that's a persistent issue. We've been working on a paper trying to understand if there's like interesting technical tools and we're not the only people doing that. Like, can you make the cost of capital lower at the same amount that we were already giving to MDBs and other things? I do think eventually the US is going to have to figure out, like, are we willing to make this part of our make the energy transition part of our economic statecraft? And that's where I think these things like the DFC investment are really important. You know, do we have a particular obligation, or are we going to be particularly helpful, just practically speaking, like funding a lot of renewables projects in emerging markets? I'm not so sure, but if we can help make like renewables projects in the sort of like self-interest of countries by distributing manufacturing or helping set up regional centers, I think that's like a more saleable option. That's what the government is trying to do right now with the PGII and other tools.
What's the PGI?
I can't remember, the Partnership for Global Investment or infrastructure investment. Yeah. I think that's probably the route forward, rather than us, you know, just like selling foreign aid in Washington is super hard, and climate investment thus far is read as foreign aid. We need to shift the frame in which people see climate investment in our political leadership.
Hello, I'm Yomna. I graduated last year, but I work here now.
Oh, cool. Congratulations.
Thank you. So my question is about the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. You said there's interest in both sides in the US for something similar.
Yeah.
A, because the US has advantage in terms of energy efficiency, and two, because it's a very efficient way to cut emissions. So my question is, recent evidence shows that countries that are likely to lose the most in terms of growth in exports and GDP are not high emission countries like India and China, but rather poor countries in Africa who are just very carbon intensive in terms of exports. So I wonder whether the debate in Washington takes into account this, like maybe like global equality lens, and how do you think the US climate leadership can maybe take these like potential losers into consideration?
It's a good question. I think that, and I think this also, like, if I can wing it a bit, I think, unfamiliar with the study, my guess is, like, you know, there was this big debate in Europe, should they use some of the carbon border adjustment revenue to aid countries or help in the decarbonization? Because if you just have a bunch of carbon intensive production going on, even in an emerging market, like, that's not exactly what you want to have over the long term. So some sort of investment scheme in that context makes a lot of sense. I don't think that won out in the end. I think the EU decided to hold on to the money. For the US, I'm not sure, I don't know how much of an issue that would present. So I will say, like, if you think about how do you kind of construct something that you think is going to be politically feasible and that would combine climate and trade and investment and technology, like cooperation, there, I think there's a pretty significant role for the US to say, you know, we want to onboard countries into some sort of trade arrangements that help decarbonize, that support decarbonize early on, but see a pathway into like a more, you know, climate club construction. That would be the way I would think about addressing that challenge.
Hi, I'm Brian, first year PhD student. So I have two questions. First is on the Carbon Club. So my question is, what is the risk that the Carbon Club isolates the US instead of positioning it in a global leadership position? Because, you know, given the cost of decarbonizing, given the carbon border adjustment mechanism, how I could see it is that, you know, it's a bifurcation of trade routes, and that would isolate the US instead of positioning as a global leader. Mm-hmm. And the second question I have is on green investments. So would green investments be better positioned as investing into grid and long duration energy storage instead of renewable energy investments, given that renewable energy is already cost competitive with coal and gas in many countries?
Okay. Repeat the second question in a shorter version, please.
Sure. Would it be better to invest in grid transmission and long duration energy storage, LDES, in developing countries instead of renewable energy, given that renewables such as solar and wind are, you know, cost competitive with coal and gas in many countries?
Oh, I think that's I think so. So the answer to the second question is like very context specific, but I would love to like learn more about it, right? So you like, if you know the picture of energy and climate finance is like is in my view like kind of still like microgrid focused, right? It's like, because it's, you know, we're very sensitive to the needs of developing economies, but like you know, the energy system that we need to build has to be big and diffuse and have transmission. So to the extent we can invest in that kind of stuff, which I think is also what PGII and other sort of emerging American models are trying to do, that's like really good. There's also just like that's, you know, it's like the dams of the 21st century, right? We're not going to, multilateral banks aren't going to build a lot of dams, I don't think, but you could imagine building like big regional grids and stuff like that. Carbon capture facilities the same way, right? If you want to get to net zero, every integrated assessment model I've looked at says you need a lot of capture around the world. I don't think that's only going to be in the United States and the Middle East. And so financing that kind of stuff is going to need a lot of help as well. On the, you know, I think anytime you're playing with, my bet is anytime you're playing with trade, it's like a very dangerous game. So you want to be a little bit careful about the policies you set up, because the urge toward protectionism and self-isolation is probably enormous, right? You want a world that has low carbon trade being relatively free to capture the benefits of free trade, and you're using trade as a tool to incentivize people moving toward that world. I don't think you want to lock it in. I think that that's a real risk.
Hi, my name's Will. I'm an MPP1. So the U.S. sometimes suffers from strategic inconsistency. I think a recent example of that would be pulling out of Paris and then subsequently rejoining it.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, is there a way to insulate U.S. participation and leadership in some of these initiatives that you've described going forward?
Yeah. I think so. Like, say you wanted to build a strategic technology portfolio for the US, right? Like that, if you can build a coalition of industry and business interests that want to see that sort of expansive investment abroad, that can have a stabilizing force. I'm not saying it guarantees it 100%, but like, you know, if you convince enough political elites in Washington, D.C. that your program is important and works well, like it usually maintains support even between fairly substantial partisan shifts. On the climate and trade nexus, this is a place where, like Robert Lighthizer, who was like Trump's trade guy, wrote in his book A Defense of Carbon Tariffs, probably on a protectionist, favoring the protectionism more than the climate stuff. But it gives us a place to think through, okay, if I can anchor here, and then I can anchor over here on a more sort of like textbook climate carbon pricing and border adjustment tool, like, can I start drawing the lines and finding something that is approachable from both sides? I think that's like how I think about it.
Thanks so much for your talk, Joseph. My name's Yasmina. I'm an MPP1. I've got two quick questions. The first is you talked about the desire to onshore supply chains for renewables and deepen our supply chains domestically.
Yeah.
How do we go about the conflict that is likely to arise with environmental regulation? I'm thinking kind of with these rare earth materials like neodymium and those which are used in kind of permanent magnets. Mm-hmm. They are often quite toxic, and often our environmental regulations create obstacles to us now domestically mining them and refining them.
Right.
The second question is, are we doing enough to make sure that we're supporting the right technologies and regulating the way that they are rolled out? I'm thinking about biomass, energy, and carbon capture, the potential adverse incentives to cut down a lot of biomass, maybe unsustainably, and also doing CCS safely.
Okay. I think that we do not want to sacrifice environmental quality in the context of pursuing these things, but you know, like for heavy and light rare earths, we are making investments in processing facilities in Texas. My guess is that they have to pass some sort of Clean Water Act evaluation. And so like we should try to do that stuff under the highest environmental standards possible. That's also, at least given like the express preference of policymakers in DC, what they would like to see. A lot of complaints about the Chinese supply chain is that it's captured the market by being dirtier and less controlled, not just in a carbon sense, but also on like, you know, water and air issues. Do I think those are in absolute contest? No. Do I think that that might impose like costs or have price effects? Yeah. And it could delay projects, right? On the which kind of like, are we supporting the right technologies to the right degree? Oh man, no, not at all. Like why, like you think about the construction of the IRA, like it's an economist's field dream, right? Like why did we give this one 30%? And why does that one get 25%? And why does this one get 3 cents a kilowatt or $3 a kilogram? And why does this one get 6 cents an hour? It's nuts. And there's no ability to, or there's no mechanism to harmonize that kind of stuff toward more efficiency, which is something we should really also be thinking about doing because those tax credits only, well, most of them end at the end of the decade. I don't have particular comments on biomass with carbon capture and storage. I read once that it's potentially really bad for food security, and I sort of believe that. I think on the carbon capture and storage front, how do we do it safely? I suppose what do you mean by safely? Is it sort of, are you concerned about leakage from reservoirs and all that kind of stuff? I think we can monitor it relatively well. I'm not overly concerned, or I've never seen any reason to be overly concerned about safety or like catastrophic releases of CO2, like the incidents with the lakes coming from a more industrial process. I actually like industrial carbon capture and storage because it's the carbon management technique where there's like a valve that with a dial and it tells you how much CO2 went down in the ground. It's much easier and more tractable, I think, to scale in that way than a lot of the nature-based solutions are probably going to be.
Hello. Hi, I'm Anurag. I'm a postdoc here.
Cool.
I wanted to ask you about, since you mentioned First Solar, I'm curious, one of the reasons First Solar has, I guess, stayed in the US and stayed out of China is because they have historically received a lot of support from the government and, marketed themselves as an American company. But in the long term, people claim that, if you want to gain efficiencies in manufacturing, China is the place to be in terms of scale and also just competitiveness in terms of factors of production.
Yep.
So what should the US strategy be broadly in terms of any new technology? Because any corporate company will want to move to China to gain that advantage in terms of cost reductions. And First Solar has avoided that path. You gave that example, but it seems difficult for a lot of companies to avoid that kind of transition into China because of their manufacturing capabilities. So how do you think of the US manufacturing strategy in the long run?
I think we should make it as easy and as inexpensive to produce stuff here as you can. So like a permissive investment environment for investment. I think there's a role for permitting reform, not sacrificing environmental quality. I think that there is if we're going to choose to onshore, as I said in the talk, we're also choosing to spend a little bit more. And that's going to limit global competitiveness if you want to create an export market. And that is something that our policymakers have decided to do. Hopefully we can capture some innovation and be a little bit better on that front. I think when I sort of what in First Solar do we want to learn from? I think technological diversification is important, right? So it's just a different supply chain. It's a different set of technologies than from what has come to dominate China. And I think we should look for other opportunities where that is the case, like hydrogen electrolyzers, where there's like kind of a technology battle going on between the electrolyzers that are China's devoting its hydrogen strategy on and what a lot of Western countries are doing. I wish I knew more about EV battery technology to give you a good example there. It seems like we're getting pretty thoroughly licked. But the broader point is try to make it as cheap as possible. Try to invest in diversification where we can. And then I think let me think. I had one other thing I wanted to answer to that. I also I'm not sure that I agree with the preposition of the question though, like foreign direct investment in China this year has gone horribly wrong. It's terrible, it's very low. Mostly because there's like perceived huge geopolitical risk. It's a bad business environment. And so the more we can make the US a very reliable, very easy place, relatively easy place for investment, I think we can over the long term win. Investing in diversification too in other places, right? Building factories in India, building them in Vietnam, building them in South America.
Hello, I'm Victoria. I'm MPA in the first year, and I'm thinking about the R&D part of all of this. So
Okay.
we talked about production and the IRA funding production, etc. I was wondering whether you could say something about is the US already spending enough on the R&D part, on really funding new technologies and exploring, and maybe how it compares to other countries. I'm from Germany, and I'm always worried about us not really spending enough on the R&D part of it and just getting locked into certain technologies. So really the research and development of the technologies, whether the US is doing enough on that, and maybe comparison to other countries, if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I don't know like relative levels compared to percentage of GDP. And if we can turn the camera off so my friends of the DOE don't hear, like I think we probably spend enough right now. Like what more interesting to me is like, should we change the models that we're using to pursue research and development, right? Like we have this big model that is sort of path dependent, has grown up in a path dependent way over the 20th century. And I like some of the ideas around like more focused research institutions, things that say like, okay, we need a technology of these characteristics. How do we get the best 60 people to come work on that for 10 years? And then then do you either like spin out the intellectual property into a company, or do you open it to the public? There's some like very interesting models that I'd love to see the US adopt, but I'd like to see that stuff happen more than I'm like, oh, this absolute level of spending needs to go up or down.
So my name is Lance Weislek, and I'm a mid-career MBA student.
Yep.
So what do you think of the criticism leveled against the IRA, which is it's a terrible piece of legislation that it picks winners and losers, and it's really just a substitute. What we should have done is just a straight up carbon tax and then let the market work its magic.
Hey man,
Why didn't Joe Manchin and the majority leader just agree on carbon?
because they don't read my blogs, Joe. I think, a first best world sounds great. It totally does. Like there's all sorts of opportunity costs to this kind of spending. I'm not convinced that if you had a carbon price, you wouldn't have some of the same onshoring effects because you just need supply chains for offshore wind, right? The political challenge of getting a really meaningful carbon price in the United States is like totally evident. And I have to trust the policymakers who said like, we're not going to vote for it. Like at some, there's a substantial amount of support for carbon pricing intellectually on the Hill. I've spent a good bit of my career arguing for why I think it's good and why it's consistent with what policymakers are saying they want, but it's not. More interesting to me is there a glide path from where we are today to a more efficient, more market-mediated system, right? So like, can we move from an IRA-based system, which has like some market effects and has like a very small price on methane emissions, small in terms of coverage, not rate, to one where like we either move through a policy sequence that goes like next to sectoral standards, right? Maybe with a fee-based structure, if we have to be subsidizing things initially. And then like, eventually, do you want to harmonize those different sectors into a carbon price? I'm not so sure. A lot of the early efficiency from a carbon price comes because you can get a lot of emissions reductions out of the power sector, and it's totally economically productive. It's like really economically productive to still drive around in a car. That might not be the same condition we have in 10 years. So I think there's like interesting intellectual questions to ask about what the like next evolution of climate policy for the United States should look like. And like the places I would look are sectoral, budgetary, so carbon pricing to help cover the yawning budget gap that the United States is going to face at the end of this decade. And then something that tries to take into account the like real political economy that won support for the IRA. Terrible piece of legislation. I don't know, but like how to move forward, I think that's the route.
Yang, I'm a postdoc here. So my question is following the R&D line. So I think in the past decades, there's like a diminishing efforts in general for technology transfers, globally on these green technologies. So what do you think is the role of US in terms of the leadership for this diffusion of new technologies, more efficient, less emission? Like, will there be more technology transfer or authorization during
Like in
this
terms of
process?
intellectual property and stuff?
Yeah.
I think that should totally be in field, right? I mean, there's a tension between like, hey, we want the US companies to gather all this money and win a bunch of stuff. But if we need to if we're investing in things for decarbonization and we want to set up arrangements with emerging markets and we want to figure out how do you get them into these like cooperative clubs, then like tech transfer or knowledge transfer has to be probably part of the equation, at least considered.
Hi, Linus Beer, also MPP1. My question is, have you any impressions from what policymakers on the Hill think about how to deal with the European carbon border adjustment mechanism going forward? Because it's, I mean, it's,
Beyond caterwauling?
Because the point is really that by 2030, we have getting any type of imports to the EU. By 2033, it's 100.
Right.
We have reactions already from China and even India thinking about their own carbon price schemes as a reaction to that, because the alternative is that anything they ship to Europe will be taxed at the European border and the tax goes to the EU budget. So it's just much smarter for them to tax it themselves, at least for their exports. When you start doing that, it gets very messy. So you could as well create your own system.
Yep.
How have policymakers thought about that in the US? Because yeah, I just wonder where this discussion will go. Will it just lead to confrontation or maybe a new debate around carbon pricing because you don't want the tax to be lost to the EU?
Amazing question. I wrote a piece last fall arguing that the US should like vigorously support the EU, even if we do nothing domestically, like even if we do nothing in response. Like we pay all sorts of border adjustments, like for VAT and other things. I think our industry can figure it out. And it's a mechanism we want to see working because that's sort of the border adjustment and tying climate and trade is like, I think, an important concept. Thus far, the response, like very few policymakers have said like, yeah, go Europe. There's a couple. There's also been a couple efforts to try and come up with a legislative response that would allow the US to have its own border adjustment, which would be harmonized or harmonizable. They kind of fit into three rough categories. One would be, I would say, sort of like tariff-based, right? So not making big changes to domestic policy, but trying to join with the EU in censuring high emitting imports and saying like, we've got this basket of stuff in the US, IRA and other things, which should justifiably let us do this carbon adjustment. Some have argued for border adjustment. So there's a bill in the Senate that would levy a border adjustment in the US and then a carbon tax on the goods covered by the EU CBAM, right? So like a lot of it is industrial goods, cement, steel. We don't like trade a lot of that stuff with Europe, but you could sort of see harmonization there. And that is an interesting model because I think Senator Whitehouse supported that bill. It's an interesting model because like, since you're levying a carbon price on goods that like consumers don't feel the primary price of, perhaps you get around some of the political challenge of raising everyone's gasoline prices, which is like still the big, this big political whale in the United States. Tariffs, border adjustment. Others see it as a chance to support a more meaningful like carbon price in the United States. Let's say on the administration side, the alternative they're argued for is this sectoral arrangement around steel and aluminum. The negotiations for that are also reaching their intended endpoint in October. Seems like the climate and trade nexus is just like, it's like a film. It's all coming together, smashing together at the same time. I don't know where those negotiations stand at this moment, but last I heard, they weren't looking particularly good. Time for one more question.
Yes, you talked a lot about, Joseph, about the energy markets, but I think it's really, really important that we get the carbon pricing right, or tariff or whatever, because hard to abate sectors like steel, chemical, cement, agriculture, which you didn't even touch on today, they are all combined roughly the same size as the entire energy economy. So that's just a comment. Since you talked about the energy market so much, the most important, the most compelling baseload technologies are fusion in the future, and geothermal.
Yeah.
I would like you just to comment on since the trade implications of fission, nuclear power generation, with China in a very much a leadership role in terms of traditional technologies. Of course, the U.S. is focusing a lot on modular small reactor. Can you talk a little bit about the U.S. versus China influence on that as a global mechanism to influence decarbonization and trade markets?
Yeah, I feel relatively positive about it, but we seem to need to get our muscle memory back, right? Like, so the US has done in the last year a couple pretty good deals with Poland, and then I think it's Romania. Poland's building an AP1000, so heavy American metal. Romania is targeting an SMR. I'd love to see that stuff. It's to me, it's the same. It fits in the same mold as what we're talking about with First Solar. It's like we've got relatively competitive technologies. We've got like broad security and economic entanglement that can follow. I think that's good. Geothermal, very interesting. I really want to see it work. If we can get American frac crews going around the world, drilling really deep holes in the ground to get hot water out, I think it's amazing. Let's do it.
So before we wrap up, two quick announcements. First, the seminar will reconvene in 2 weeks. We're taking next Monday off, but in 2 weeks, we will meet in the David Rubenstein Democracy Lab. That's David Elwood Democracy Lab. That's Rubenstein 414, where we met last year. We'll be meeting there the rest of the semester. We'll have Katrina O'Rourke of the Climate Leadership Council joining us for a talk.
She's excellent.
Yes. Because we invite excellent speakers for this series. The second announcement, if you're interested, tomorrow night in the forum, the Institute of Politics will be hosting a conversation with two commissioners of the Climate Overshoot Commission, Francis Beinecke, who is a commissioner and former head of NRDC, major environmental group here in the US, Hina Rabbani Kar, former foreign minister of Pakistan as well, who's one of the commissioners. So we'll have a conversation about how we reduce the risk of climate overshoot. So if you're around and want to join us at 6 o'clock tomorrow night in the forum, please do so. Finally, please join me in thanking Joseph Majkut for a fantastic presentation today.
Thank you all. That was really fun. You good?